Um, so this is your hidden storytelling skills. It's lesson 4, section 3. And just to kind of recap of where we've been, we've looked at in lessons 1 through 3, story adjustment sliders. Why sliders? What's the point of that? It's about adjusting, right? And you just storytelling involves continuous adjustments, and so, but you want to understand some of your options for those adjustments so that you can make them, right? And become skilled as making them, as you do, and these understanding your options gives you full access to creating any desired effect.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, few tellers and writers have a full understanding and fully developed skills for this. Hang on, I'm seeing myself. I know what I'll do. I don't really want to see myself from the point of view of my phone. You can see one of me now, right? Yeah, that's quite enough. So what was I just saying? I got distracted.
You were just talking about what's on the slide, fully developed skills that few tellers and writers have it.
Got it. All right. So once you have a familiarity with the adjustments that are available to you, and let me just back up and say that natural storytellers have learned a lot of this unconsciously. And the good news is that they make use of a lot of this. So that is great. There's two potential parts of bad news. One is that the parts that they didn't learn unconsciously, they don't know how to go about learning. And since they're not aware of what they actually learn and even what they actually do, they give other people bad advice. Right? Because they're only aware of what they do, so they tell people to do what they're aware of doing, or else parroting what everybody else has told them to do since they were in school about creating outlines and all that. Now, outlines are valuable, but if you start there, you run the serious risk of focusing on the words and what you're saying and not on imagining the story. And every natural storyteller, every human being who never heard of storytelling but just does it, that's how they tell stories. They imagine, they start to tell it to people, they notice the responses. Based on those responses, they adjust until they finally feel like, oh yeah, maybe I wasn't even sure what I wanted to get across when I started, but now when you reacted that way, that's it. And then of course the next time they tell it, it's more likely to go even better. So that's just what people do. And it's fine to add to that, but we don't want to subtract that from it. That's how people naturally tell stories. And so anyway, that's my observation. So once you have familiarity with the adjustments available to you and practice making those adjustments in pursuit of your own story goals, very important, then you're free to simply apply those skills for the rest of your career as a writer or a teller. And all this applies to written storytelling as well as oral storytelling. Obviously, they are different media, so there's different nuances and different specific tools you have in each, but nonetheless, the basic idea of the sliders and being able to adjust and then notice the effects of the adjustments and then continue to improve, that it doesn't matter what form, even if you're doing a movie about storytelling, about a story, all that still applies. One big payoff we've had so far, that we've known enough about the reality of story sliders to make sense of the oft-quoted but imprecise and often very confusing advice: show, don't tell. People quote that and without really being aware that they don't know what it means, or what they think it means is not what really helps. So those words are at least as confusing and misleading as they are helpful by themselves. It doesn't mean that there's not some there's not some reality, but this isn't a very effective way to describe it. So our big payoff so far has been by understanding that questionable advice with the help of the interaction of two story sliders, the concreteness slider and the name the other one we have so far.
Interpretation?
The interpretation slider. This sounds right to me. Yeah. So then we can understand the principles and strategies behind the much repeated but little understood and often described in misleading terms admonition, show, don't, tell. So our first slider we've been dealing with is the concreteness slider. As you know, there's 4 bands on this slider, and these are arbitrary, but it's like colors of the rainbow, right? We have to have some language for talking about each band. Where does red end and orange begin? There's no particular place, but we just make an arbitrary idea. We're going to call this red and this orange, not to limit it, but to give ourselves a way to refer to what we're talking about. So these bands of concreteness are in that spirit. It's not that there's a hard line between abstract and summarized and so on. It's just that abstract speaks pretty well to a particular band, which fades imperceptibly into another band that's pretty well described by summarize. So just as the painter adjusts dark and light to make the most important figures in a painting stand out, the storyteller adjusts concreteness to make the most important actions stand out. And I'm saying actions there because it's the essence of story. With no actions, there's no story. But there's more to story, of course, than actions. There's descriptions, there's linguistic play, there's any number of things. But all this actually applies to that as well. Although if you do all these other things but don't actually get people to imagine some kind of a narrative, then you're doing great stuff, but it's not storytelling. Right? So that's the all of it. So the concreteness slider already dealt with some amount of time. Here's the rundown of it. Right. So what kind of actions are we talking about with abstract, the abstract band on the concreteness slider? Well, an abstract statement in the concreteness slider doesn't describe any action in the story at all. It's abstract. It's apart from the narrative, although it's going to probably inform the narrative, comment on the narrative, set up expectations for the narrative, all those things, but it doesn't actually move the narrative forward. There's no action in the story. Summarized action is a non-specific action, right? We talked about this, about Doug studied as opposed to Doug pulled out a book, opened it, and went to page 42. Right. The concrete action is one or more distinct concrete actions. Doug opened his book and read it. Right. The blow by blow, of course, is a series of concrete actions that usually might also be described as a single action. So I scratched my head. What was it I was going to read today? Oh, I remember. So I went to the shelf and I looked for it, and there it was. I thought it was red, but actually it was a green cover. Doesn't matter, because I pulled it out, put it happily on my lunch table, and began to read. Right. So that's an example. Not especially good one or bad one. Does it include action detail? Abstract statement? No action. There's no action at all. That's the definition of it. How about a summarized action statement? Does it include action detail?
No.
No, it doesn't. It's a non-specific action, a summarized statement, like I read a book. No details in that. It's got its place. It's a good thing. Nothing bad with it, but it's different. Concrete action statement. One or more distinct concrete actions doesn't include action detail.
Maybe.
Well said. Hey, when you said it, it appeared on my screen. How about that?
Amazing.
And the blow by blow. Does it include
Yes.
action detail? It has to. That's part of the definition,
Yeah.
blow by blow. Now, there's more detail and less detail, but we're just looking at a band here. And within that band, there can be more and less and so on. But to be in that band, it has to have a series of concrete actions that usually might also be described as a single action, which is to say, there's some detail there. Can you draw in any sensory mode, a sense of draw, which could include, acting out with your body or anything like that. So we're using draw as the blanket term for creating a representation of it in any mode. Can you do that in any sense? Can you do that with an abstract statement in any sensory mode? Could you draw it or
No.
Uh,
No. No.
no. Summarized?
No.
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 Concrete?
Yes.
Yeah. Blow by
Yes.
blow?
Yes.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yes.
Good. All right. Could you follow the instructions to do this?
No.
For abstract?
No.
No, because there's no action. So there's no right. For summarized?
No.
No. For concrete?
Yes.
For blow by blow?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good.
Yes.
Does it move the narrative forward? Abstract?
The narrative. No.
No,
No.
it doesn't move the narrative forward. It might influence the narrative, it might give us some expectations, but it doesn't actually move the what happens forward because nothing happens, right? Does a summarized story statement move the narrative forward?
Summarize statement.
Summarized.
I think it can.
Is that you, Sue?
I think it can.
Yeah, so I have it as a yes. Because a non-specific action, I read a book, is summarized, and it can move the action forward, narrative forward. I read a book. When I get to page 32, out jumped a mouse, and I chased it around, and the rest of the day I spent chasing. So the reading the book is not specific action, but it still can move the narrative forward. How about the concrete action statement?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Blow by blow?
Yes.
Yes, good.
Yes.
What kind of a statement can it be replaced with? You know what I mean by replaced with? I can say, I got up, pulled down, blah, 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 and started at page 38 and read for 40 minutes. Or I can say I read a book, and so those one could replace the other, right? So what kind of a statement can an abstract statement be replaced with?
An abstract statement.
Yeah, another abstract statement, or just omit it altogether, because you don't have to replace them. They're important to the narrative. They tell us things about the narrative and what to expect in the narrative, but they're not the narrative per se. And so you can always leave it out or do another abstract. How about a summarized statement? What can it be replaced with?
Concrete or blow by blow.
Well said. A concrete, what can it be replaced with?
Blow by blow. I would think.
Blow by blow.
Or summary.
And or yes, exactly. And so the third answer is going to be pretty easy, right?
Concrete or summary.
Summarize. So these three from summarized over are concrete enough that they can move the narrative forward. And so where you can use any one of them, you can use any of the three. And again, you get to put in abstract statements or not, but they do not take the place of the narrative because hello, it's a narrative. Any questions on any of this? You guys ace this little quiz. Questions or comments? Going. Come on, okay. So these are our 4 steps on the concreteness slider. To live alone, you mean be yourself. Abstract, summarize, John had breakfast. Concrete, John ate a bowl of cereal. Blow by blow, John picked up his spoon, dipped it in the bowl, then brought the cereal to his mouth. Again, keep in mind that these are just points on the spectrum. These are our examples of red and green and blue and so on. and that you can, it can be more concrete or less concrete and still fit in that band, although it can't hardly be any less concrete than that. So 4 stops on the concreteness slider. Now the interpretive language slider, which we also dealt with. So here we have three stops on this, 3 bands. The pure description, the implicit interpretation, and the explicit interpretation. Now, why are those? Is this in the nature of the universe? No. This is in the nature of Doug trying to describe something in the nature of the universe in a way that would make sense for us and give us names to be able to look at different bands on the spectrum, right? It's a spectrum, but in my opinion, and my experience teaching it to people, these 3 give us enough specificity to be able to describe meaningfully. And if we get much more specific, it stops being useful. So these are 3 bands on the interpretive language slider. Pure description. Example, John's mother quickly guided John's hand to his mouth. You probably already have in your mind very complicated versions of that because you've imagined it in all kinds of forms. Implicit interpretation, John's mother abruptly moved John's hand to his mouth. It's a little bit more interpretive than guided. Abruptly moved tells us something about her intention or her attitude as she does it. That's different from quickly guided. Quickly probably adds a little bit, but this is more so. And then John's mother impatiently shoved John's hand to his mouth. The word impatiently and shoved, those 2 together, actually are explicitly telling us things about how this happened, how to interpret the action itself. So that's why I call it explicit interpretation. Implicit interpretation, abruptly moved. Well, we're getting a sense, but we don't know. Is she abruptly moving it out of fear, out of impatience, for any number of reasons that might make her be abrupt there. So we get an idea. It moves our mind in the direction of a certain field of the interpretations possible, but it isn't. It isn't pure description where there's no interpretation, and it isn't explicit. So it's right in the middle. And again, I just made up these 3 bands, but those seem to be the ones that made sense to me. When I tried to make them into more detail, it didn't seem to add anything. Pure description, John grabbed her wrist and bit it. Okay. Who can give us an implicit interpretation version of that? Take a stab. Getting it wrong is as useful for everybody as getting it right.
Well, I think I know what explicit, because it looks like explicit is emotional, but I don't know how to, so it would be John grabbed her wrist and angrily bit it or something, but I don't know what would be between. Because grabbed her wrist and bit it is pretty explicit right there.
Right. Abruptly, I counted that as implicit interpretation, right? As opposed to impatiently shoved.
So abruptly grabbed her wrist?
Yeah, that would work. Good. Well done. Somebody else give us another version.
How about John hesitantly grabbed her wrist?
Yeah, that's right. That certainly gives it a different interpretation on it, doesn't it? It points us in the direction of that. It's not a full out interpretation, but suddenly, hesitantly, well, it's very different from abruptly, isn't it? Good. Is this making sense to you guys? Anybody else want to just try one? Just if you feel like you don't know how to do this thing, try it and we'll help you. Or if you don't even know how to try it, then tell me and I'll help you get to that point. So it appears to be using the strategy of writing something down. That could be helpful. Sometimes that might help you if it's hard to think. Just,
Well, last week we said John seized her wrist and sank his teeth into it.
Yes. Yes, that certainly would be, let me see, would that be implicit interpretation? Yeah. That's what I have there on this, on it's the same chart. So, we're getting the idea of the seizing and the sinking the teeth tells us something about his attitude, but is he doing it to stop her from getting gangrene because she just or to suck out the venom from a flying insect? To get her attention, it's implicit, it's interpretive, more interpretive than pure description, but it's not explicit why he's doing this. All right, who will give us an example for implicit interpretation of the same thing about grabbing the wrist and biting it, or seizing the wrist and sinking his teeth into it?
John angrily grabbed her wrist and bit her.
Nice.
Bit
Yeah, angrily tells us a lot. Someone else? Anyone else have one? Take a stab, because if the most useful thing is if you do it wrong, because then you get to learn how to do it right. If you don't take a chance, you don't learn anything.
How about John yanked his mother's arm and bit her wrist, or something like that.
Yeah, good. So the yanked is the part that's more interpretive than grab the wrist or even seize his ribs. Where's the explicit interpretation? Where's the part that tells us exactly how he means this?
I would think it was yanked. Well, I guess yanked is similar to seized.
Yeah, it's maybe even a little bit less interpretive than seized.
Okay.
Yeah. Take your time to struggle with this. This isn't school where you have right answers and wrong answers. This is just giving yourself a chance to bounce off this material.
Well, okay, I'm just, it's like John seized her wrist so or something about squeezing her wrist
Nice.
so hard that that the mother screamed.
Nice. Good.
I don't know how to phrase it in one easy sentence.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah. He grabbed her wrist so hard that she screamed.
Yeah.
And it could have a lot more language than that. It's just I only have this little bit of bitty squares to fit it and the words into on the slide. Good. Somebody else give us an explicit interpretation of some form of John grabbed your wrist and bit it. Lorraine, did it your hand up? Yeah, go ahead, Lorraine. Oh, Lorraine, you're muted.
John suddenly took hold of his mother's wrist and sank his vampire teeth into it.
Good. That's interpreting. Giving us a lot more interpretation, isn't it? Either they're play vampire teeth, which is still more, or he's a real vampire, which is a lot more interpretation, right? So good. Anybody want to take another shot at this, or a shot if you haven't yet?
Well, is it really that it's why, or why? So it's emotion? Is that the
Yeah,
difference between implicit and the others and explicit?
It can be. Emotion is part of the why and part of also the I don't have a good word that doesn't use emotion, but it gives us the flavor of it, right? Um, you know, you know, crying. He said, "Don't do that," as opposed to, at the top of his lungs, he shouted, "Don't do that!" Right? Those are all um, have that emotional level
If
because
there's an interpretation, yeah, at the top of his lungs would be angry or
yeah, exactly.
so.
And emotion is really, emote to do motion out of,
Oh,
right? So it comes from that root, and our motivation is almost by definition emotional. Now there can be other aspects to it, that aren't the emotional aspect of it per se. Seeing no better way to save his mother from the whatever, or to save his dog from his mother's uh, uh, violent clutches, right? So the interpretive part is always about the why, and often that's a big subset of that is the emotional flavor.
emotion. So, yeah. So I think I said before, angrily, John seized his mother's wrist and bit her.
Yes, good. Yeah, the anger tells us a lot. Do you guys feel happy on this? Should we go on, or yeah? Okay. So furious, John seized her wrist and savagely bit it. So there's two things here. There's the adverb savagely. There's the adjective furious, and they are similar, but they do actually each refine the other a little bit. Savagely is one thing, furious is another, and you put them together, they fit together, but it adds to it. So, feeling happy with this? Sweet. John's mother slowly walked from the room.
John's mother walked from the room with her head down.
Oh, lovely.
That's good.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, her head down could be because the sun is glaring through the window ahead of her, but it certainly could be, which is part of the motivation, as it were, or it certainly could be out of shame or humiliation, or feeling defeated, something like that. So good, perfectly done. Everybody happy, or somebody else? If you feel any hesitancy here, just try it out, because that's the way you'll get to try something, get feedback, and have a better chance, additional chances in the future. Going? Okay, go on. So implicit interpretation, an example would be John's mother walked somberly from the room. Right. So the somberly is definitely interpreting it, how she is, and something about maybe why she's doing it, but it's not enough explicit to get us to know exactly what she's feeling or why she's doing it. John's mother, aware that something was broken forever between them, walked from the room with a heavy heart. Now that's much more explicit, and we know why she's walking from the room, and we have information about what's making her heart feel heavy. Okay, moving right along. So where we are in this course and where we're headed, there are more of these skills to learn, and we'll learn more of them in the lessons after this one. We're going to take this lesson to notice the bigger picture of storytelling skills, that these hidden skills augment, because these are the hidden skills, but they're not the only skills. So the goal of this lesson is to create that context for what we've done, if we will ever. So what have we learned so far? We did that. Where do novelists start their process? Storytelling is a revolutionary technology, the central act of storytelling, first two story growing processes, and the third story growing process. So this isn't a course in these things, so we'll zip right through them, but I think if we give you a sense of the parts of storytelling that are complementary to the parts we've been focusing on. Where do novelists start their process? And this is just a kind of an outlier, but just to give a sense of, these are three famous novelists. And when they begin to write a novel, what do they have in their mind? Vladimir Nabokov, right? Very prolific novelist. I think he's won big prizes. He won big prizes. He has in his mind, before he starts to write, a clear preview. Right, so he has a pretty good idea of what's coming. Right, it's a preview. It's not, if you think of the 3-minute preview for a 2-hour movie, it doesn't give you anything, but it might give you a sense of some of the highlights and so on. So that's what Nabokov had in his mind. On the other hand, William Faulkner, another great writer, said he started with a memory or a mental picture. So that's a lot less specific than a clear preview, but it's something he had in his mind, right? A memory came when he began to sit down to write or stand up to write, whatever he did, or some kind of mental picture in his mind, which you and I would call an image of some kind of mental image. Aldous Huxley, another famous writer, he said when he sits down to write, he has a dim idea of what's coming. So just notice that there's not the right way to do this. You can start knowing more or less. It's the process that gets you there. And that's all that matters, is that you can get there. And, if you're Vladimir Nabokov and all you have is a dim idea, you're probably going to stay with it, let it gestate more in your mind before you go sit down to write it. But nonetheless, Isaac Dinesen, what does she have in mind before she sits down to write? A tingle. Even dimmer than a dim idea, right? So just notice that there's no right way. There's no right way to say, okay, I'm ready to start. There's no right way to say, I want to write it, what should it be about? And if you're Isaac Dinesen, you just have a tingle about what it's about, and you go from there. If you're Vladimir Nabokov, you're a lot further along in narrowing it down, but there isn't a right way or wrong way. It's a choice you get to make. It might vary from one project to another, one story to another, one book to another. All right, so storytelling as a revolutionary technology in our human history. And by the way, I meant to say this at the beginning, but we've been focusing very much on the hidden storytelling skills and the sliders and all that stuff. And I'm taking this lesson 4, to kind of back out, zoom the lens out, and look at the big picture in which all that fits. So that's why we're kind of going over storytelling basics here.
Nice.
So the African savanna is where our species arose for the most part. Before there was language in storytelling, if you came across a saber-toothed tiger out in the world, in the jungle or the whatever it is you're in, and you were alone and you figured a way to outwit it, when you came back, you had all these other people whose lives could be saved by that. But without some form of storytelling, you couldn't convey it. So imagine what a huge step forward it was in our ability to survive when we could have more and more people doing it, telling a story around the fire, for example. So these are brain scans. They are mock brain scans. They're not actual brain scans. But it would be true if we had somebody's actual brain scans. If the storyteller, we could see the actual brain scan, hopefully in more detail than this. And then we looked at the brain scan of the listener. They wouldn't be identical, but they seem to be similar. So in other words, when you're imagining something to tell me, and I'm then hearing it and imagining it in my mind, it actually lights up similar parts of our brain. So in a way, this isn't surprising at all. Hello, your brain is how you do this. But on the other hand, storytelling seems so high level that we hardly can imagine that it's going to show up in the low level issues of how many of which neurons are active. So this is called neural coupling, where something in this case, the speaker's brain waves turns out to be very similar to something in the listener's brain waves. And that is a kind of a coupling. And this is a neurological term, neural coupling, where my neural activity couples with your neural activity, vice versa. So this has survival value. There's a reason that a lot of things come up and somebody has it and it never goes into the general population because it didn't make it more likely that these people would survive. But this ability to do this communicative act of storytelling, which has the effect of helping you think something, experience something more like what I'm thinking and experiencing, that has survival value. Because it means that without you being there, I could transfer my experience to your mind, or vice versa. And that's huge. In our society, storytelling is, well, in the last 20 or 30 years, it's become more respectable, but it's still not a real thing like mathematics or business, right? But mathematics and business never had as much survival value as storytelling, in my opinion. All right, so to turn an experience into a narrative, you have to start by imagining it in your own mind. And when you've done that, then you turn that into something oral, right? Something with words. If it's written words, fine. If it's oral language, then it's oral language, which includes words, but many other things, right? We'll get into that. And then the person hearing what you're saying, the story, gets to turn that into their own, into something. They get to have the effect of that on their own neurological state. So the agenda for today is the importance of storytelling to our species. We've touched on this. The central act of storytelling, the first two story growing processes, a third story growing process. So when my first jobs in the world were as a preschool teacher. And well, first working with children in a mental health ward, but I wasn't a teacher. I was actually I forget what our title was, but anyway, I was the counselor, as it were, and so there were actually teachers that came on the ward and gave the kids school for a couple hours every day. My job was hard, but I had no coveting for that job, because by and large, these kids were not interested in learning something because you wanted them to learn it. They're interested in learning, but not with that background. So I got this job in this private lab school associated with a college for emotionally disturbed young teens. Like the youngest were 10, the oldest were nominally 13, but we had some that couldn't be placed out, so I had 15-year-olds. And I was the new teacher and the one of only two men on the faculty. And because I was that meant that I was by some magical code, I was going to get the oldest boys. And so I wasn't doing very well with them. They resisted everything. That was the one thing about school, the one school ability they had down, resisting the teacher. They've basically all been kicked out of one school or another, maybe some several schools. And the one reliable coping method was to resist. And they were excellent at it. So things had not been going that well. And a symptom of that was that I would arrive at school and sit in the parking lot for extraordinarily long time, trying to get up the energy to go in and face another day. And at the beginning, it was 5 minutes, turning into 15, 20 minutes. This particular day, it was a rainy day. So of course I was even less reluctant to get out and run in the rain. But I finally realized I was so late that all the other teachers were already in their classrooms. So if I went in now, opened that door to the school, I wouldn't see anybody. And so they wouldn't know how late I was. So, okay, that did it. That finally got me out of the car. I went running in. I opened the door to the school. And there, standing up the 3 steps in the door frame, were all 5 of the other teachers. I said, what? They said, Ted Selesky's out sick. No. You see, these kids came from all over the Boston area. And because of that, and they had like private cabs or 2 or 3 in a cab. So they arrived at all different times. And so they were allowed to arrive a whole hour before school started. And if the weather was nice, Ted Selesky, this assistant principal, would supervise them on the playground until we got there, and he could pass them off to us. Or if it was a rainy day, he would take them into the one room that almost fit all 70 of them. It fit them, but it was cramped. And then he would tell them stories. And I was kind of curious because my dad told me stories. Storytelling wasn't a thing in my life yet. But I remember asking the kids one day, did Ted tell you stories? Yeah. What kind of stories were they? Good ones. So I was pretty clear that this was not an experience they wanted to share with me. And I had other battles to fight, so I didn't fight it. But Ted's out sick. They're all in there. And it happened that my favorite part of being in this job was I was officially college faculty. And my favorite part of being college faculty was that I had a college library card. My favorite part of having a college library card was that this college, it wasn't a huge library, but they had about 300 LP folk music records. It was about 3 feet long. And that was what I wanted to do. So every day I would go in as the day was over, I'd take out 3 records, folk music records, the first 3 in the alphabet. And then I take them home, listen to them. The next morning, I'd return them in the morning. The next evening, I'd take out the next 3. So this was November. I was up to H. And the evening before, as I was going home, I stopped at H, and the next 3 included one that I almost didn't take out. It was called Ray Hicks of Beech Mountain, North Carolina, tells 4 traditional jack tales. Now, I didn't know from Ray Hicks, I didn't know from Jack Tales. I did think of Jack and the Beanstalk, but why did I hear about that? But Beech Mountain, North Carolina. Now, that was a remote area in North Carolina where people had been collecting really old folklore since the 1930s. So, okay, if it's about Beech Mountain, North Carolina, I'll take it home and listen to it. So I brought it home. There were 2 stories on a side of the LP. Remember LPs? Anybody? Certainly, your grandparents told you about them. So the first one took about 20 minutes or so to play, or 15 minutes, I don't know what. And I listened to it, and somewhere early on in the second one, I fell asleep. So I'd heard one story. Oh, by the way, that story that when I first heard it, it began something like, well, Jack and his mother were having a hard time. It's like, what? Please let there be a transcription inside this, and there was. So it was written out into language that I could interpret from the written word, and so I by the end of that first story, I could follow it pretty well, and I fell asleep and woke up to this sound that I no longer ever wake up to. Some of you may be too young to remember that, but that was the sound of the LP needle coming on the last band, and just doing that over and over again until I finally woke up and turned it off. So woke up, I came into school, and I'm supposed to go in there and do something. I heard a story last night. Maybe I could tell that. They said, yes, do that. They shoved me. I'm practically falling over. They're so eager to get me there. I have something that would make it be my turn to do this, right? And so I get there, and I'm standing in front of the kids, and they gave me the usual, right? And I said, I'm going to tell you a story. And they gave me the look like, it better be a good one, like Ted Selesky tells us. And I hadn't exactly rehearsed this story, but I had learned some basic oral storytelling techniques, not knowing that was what they were from my dad. Just to imagine what happened, and think of the first thing to imagine, and then start telling, or think of the last thing that happened. So think of the first thing to telling, start telling that, and keep going until you get to the last thing. That was my dad's quick course in storytelling, which it was not a bad way to start at all. And so I'm up there, and I'm like, I'm going to tell you a story, and this, I'm like, it better be a good one. And so I didn't remember the first line, because I had to work so hard to figure out what the guy was actually saying. Well, Jack and his mother were having a hard time. And Jack had to leave home, go out in the world alone, and earn his own fortune. I was just looking at the story in my mind. But at that point, I just sort of paused, and I looked up. And their faces had changed from this. Whoa. That's the most rewarding transformation I've had in all these months. I'm going to keep doing this, right? So I told the story, and when the story was over, they sort of shook themselves out of the story listening trance and began misbehaving again, but it was too late. I'd seen that it was possible to have them on my side. So I began to pursue storytelling, not because as an art form, but as a way to survive with these kids. So, okay, that's my little story about this. Question for you: in your mind, how were those children arranged in the room? Were they, were they sitting down, standing up, lying on the floor? How are they actually there? Facing around? In your mind, did you imagine the children? If so, how were they arranged? What were they doing in the room? Yes, Sarah.
Well, I didn't think it was a regular classroom, but they were all there. So I thought there were tables with chairs, and some kids were there, and then some kids were lined around the walls behind them.
Nice, nice. Someone else, how did you imagine them in the room? Sue.
So I didn't imagine any tables or chairs, although they probably were there.
No.
I saw the older ones standing, and then the younger ones sitting. Kind of maybe even like a little space between some age groups, just a little.
Nice.
And then as you began to tell, I would see their bodies relaxing, maybe even one or two people sitting down.
Sweet, lovely. Lorraine, did you have any image of how they were in the room?
Well, quite similarly to Sarah and Sue, and I imagine some kids were up and kind of fiddling with something on a shelf and
Right.
looking away. And but then as you were telling the story, they stopped and just, you know, turned and listened to you, looked at you.
Nice. So notice how rich and detailed and varied your internal images were with a very small amount of stimulation on my part. It was, and by then you already were sort of caring for me a little bit, caring about me. So it wasn't you weren't tuned out of the story, you were tuned into the story. But do you realize, I mean, think about that. What you each imagined was fairly detailed and fairly vivid. And so this is a very important thing about how stories work. It's what I call the central act of storytelling, which is, in brief, that at the moment of listening, the listener creates internal images. And by images, I mean representations of what's going on. And the listener does it quickly, effortlessly, and uniquely. You know, if we had 100 people and I asked a question, the first sentence might be the same with several of them, but when you get it, keep asking for the details, it's always going to be different. No two people imagine the same part of the same story exactly the same. So this is the central act of storytelling. Notice it's not what the teller does. It's what the listeners do. But this is where the magic happens. You know, and what the teller does can be with grunts and mime. It can be with, you know, a movie. It can be with whatever. But whatever the teller does to make it happen, this is where the magic lies. When the listeners do this, internal images, almost instantaneously, with, you know, effortlessly, and each in their own unique way. So it's the listener and the images that are the key things here. And the images are not necessarily visual images. Some of you mentioned visual images, but I meant to take a personal note. But at least one of you mentioned an image that wasn't visual, something in your body or your feeling or a concept or something. Sounds. Did anybody imagine any sounds? Sure.
No, just they were listening, so it was quiet in the room.
Right. But
As soon as you
before that, it
started.
wasn't quite in the room. Or did you imagine any sounds when it was engaged with the teachers or anything? Lorraine.
Well, the only sounds I heard in my imagination was of the kids who were up, you know, fiddling with something and, you know,
Yes.
getting into a box and, you know, and all of that. And
Nice. Yeah, and so that's also imagining. Again, in our culture, we have the unfortunate habit of equating imagining with visualizing. And in our culture, visualizing is our lead sense, but it's not their only sense. And you're likely to imagine sounds or feelings in your own body and other sensory modes as well. Occasionally even smells or tastes and so on. So it doesn't have to be a visual image. It can be an image in any sensory mode. This is the central act of storytelling. It's what happens at the moment of listening. And it's not what the teller does, it's what the listener does. Because, you know, I can, you know, I can walk around the block all day long telling my story out loud, but nothing actually interesting happens until somebody listens to it. And then that's where the magic starts to happen. We'll talk later about sensory modes. But so this idea that the listener creates unique images implies something, which is number one, stories are inherently participatory. You are making things in your mind when you're listening to a story. It's not passive, it's active. Stories are inherently diversity friendly because you get to make the images that you want. And if I was making a big deal about the desks, which I didn't, but even so, I just mentioned them, and a couple of you mentioned them in your imaginings. But if there are people who were from a village in Africa where school happened sitting on a blanket on the ground, then that person could imagine children sitting on a blanket on the ground, but they're free to do that. And so no matter what your background is, what your experiences are, you get to make your own images regardless. So there's no entrance test for being a story listener. Stories are made of images, they're not made of words. And this is important. We are taught to think of stories as made of words. As it turns out, that's a really a thinning out way of looking at stories and what they're made of. But when you think of them in terms of images, that opens a whole dynamic range, which is in fact more accurate in terms of what happens. So the central act of storytelling, the listener creates unique images. And then there's these three things we learn about storytelling just from that fact: participatory, diversity friendly, and not made of words, but made of images. So we look at that, stories are made of images, not words. An example would be that recipe for saffron risotto there is not the food. Right? You don't eat the recipe card. The recipe card gives you the instructions for creating something that will then be nourishing. And the same way is true about the words. They are like the recipe card that give you the ingredients to be able to imagine. And it's what you imagine in your own mind. It's in different sensory modes that is actually the product. That's parallel to the idea that the words on a book, if you're doing a written story or if you just learned a story from a book, they are not the story. The words aren't the story. The words lead you to create the story in your mind, but they're not the story. And the story, whoever wrote that book had images in that person's mind, and whoever reads the book ends up with images in their mind. And those words are important, but they're just important as a conduit, as a in-between. There's a word I'm looking for, I can't think of it. So what's the first job then, based on this, as a storyteller? It is to stimulate your listeners to imagine. Now you have to do some things before that, but it's the first thing you really have to accomplish, is to stimulate your listeners to imagine. If you don't do that, nothing else you're doing will actually help. And because of this truth that I absolutely believe in, you immediately, if you understand this is what the essence of it is, then all the things we're told in school about what the story is are just like, they're just side issues. They're not really what a story is. They're not really the job of the storyteller. And if you've been, if you got this far in this course, you have at least given up to some extent the idea that stories are made of words that you memorize. But if you had that, it wasn't your idea. It was a bad idea, but it wasn't your idea. And so just to notice, your job, your first job, the key job, is to stimulate your listeners to imagine. And by the way, that's true whether you're in person or whether you're on the phone or whether you're doing mime or whatever. You have to stimulate your listeners to imagine. So what we can call the central act of storytelling is that at the moment of telling, the listener, the teller says things that stimulate listeners to have images, and the way that that happens, the medium for that is oral language with in-person storytelling. With written stories, of course, is written language, but most storytelling in the world is oral language. Most storytelling in any given day in our lives is oral language. It may not be a long literary story, but it may be, what, you didn't bring home the bread? Oh, I was going to, but right, we tell those stories all the time using oral language. What is oral language? It is not words on a page. It includes a number of important elements, including your posture. If you're slumping as you say something, we interpret differently than if you're doing this or being defiant or something. Tone of voice, huge thing. You can, the difference between I love you and I love you. I added some gesture there, but facial expression, but still, tone makes all the difference. How fast you're talking, that makes a difference. How loud, soft you're talking, your facial expressions, all those things make a difference. These are all part of the tools you have when you're telling oral language. Your hands, your gestures, your eyes, your eye expressions. Are they open and closed? Where are your eyes looking at? All those things. Your position in space. And there's more. Those are only some of the elements of oral language that are part of our toolkit when we are, as oral storytellers, stimulating our listeners to imagine. And they're part of the toolkit even for written storytellers who are trying to do that, but through the additional filter of the written word. So, a time you felt like your real self. I'd love you to just take a minute to think about this. It's just a prompt, and you can. I want you to notice what comes up when I ask you what was the time you felt like your real self. Now, it might not be a time you felt like your real self. What might come up, and that might be a time when oh man, I sure didn't feel like my real self then. That's fine. It may be something completely different. This is just a prompt. It's not a quiz. And so whatever came up to you when you heard me say that or saw it on the screen, if nothing came up to you, then just take a while to let your mind ponder on time I felt like my real self. What does that mean to me? Well, it sort of means, well, then there was a time when, so let yourself take, at least a minute, maybe longer, to ponder that and just notice as you go. Okay, clear? You're on. Time you felt like your real self. That's a minute. Anybody have something that came up in your mind?
I have something.
Yes, the same.
So it was one time I have to say that asking that question, I sort of got a survey of all these different times,
Right.
seemed like my real self. But then I thought, well, here's kind of the opposite, which I did feel like myself. And I was in an online class, and it was about well, what do you want to communicate when you write your book? And so we were working in partner, and I realized, even though I knew stuff that I'd been working on in my dissertation, it's like, what do I want to communicate? I was speechless. I just was speechless. And, the question still kind of lingers. I have content, but what is it that I'm really trying to communicate? So
Mm.
that's my example.
Thank you. Lovely. Beautifully done.
Yeah.
Well done. Somebody else wanted to share one? Oh, Sarah.
Sure. And this is actually, I feel like it's related, Sue. Several weeks ago, I was invited to be a featured teller at Story Space, which means you have 40 to 50 minutes. Now, I tell short stories, so I knew I had to put together a program, which I did. And there are two incidents. One is I was going to tell a particular story only because it was one of my longest ones. Luckily, right before I said, no, that's not a good reason. So I came up a little short. The other thing that happened was that there were two of the stories, and I think I ended up telling 6-ish. There were two of them that I felt I was really in them and doing a good job. And so just that contrast with, wow, those are two I really care a lot about. And the other ones are good, but it was different. So that was, in terms of communication, I guess, made me think of that.
Yes, lovely. Thank you for that. Do you have something, Lorraine?
Yes, actually, it was just this last Sunday,
Mm.
and I was in transformational storytelling with Sarah, and I had been dreading doing this project in some ways, but I was working with a wonderful study partner, and we really helped each other. And I talked about my background. And what had brought me to storytelling, and talked some about my ancestors and my parents and grandparents. And it was different than just than telling a story, as a narrator. I was really, just me. It was just me, and I got tongue tied sometimes because it was so much was coming up as I was doing it, but I knew I just had to. I just had to tell the truth of my life, and so that's what I tried to do.
Sweet.
And she did a beautiful, beautiful job. Beautiful job.
I love
Oh,
it.
thank you. Thank you.
Well, good. Well, thank you all for doing that. Um, um, I, I, that was all stuff. So,
Do you have one, Doug? Do you have one?
let's see. Um,
Yeah.
I think there's time for me to do this. A time I felt like my real self. Well, actually, just a few days ago, I live in Atlanta. It can be pretty hot here, even in May. And have a little dog that needs to be walked. And I've been sort of increasing how far I walk her. I mean, she's this big, and I'm kind of building up her endurance. And so I've been walking further and further, which means that I have not been doing my usual bike riding, because I'm spending, almost an hour taking her on 3 20-minute walks in a day. And so I wasn't as logy, which is usually my stimulus to go out there and ride the bike, and time was short and everything. And then I just decided, hey, this is ridiculous. I love to ride my bicycle. And so I got on my bicycle, and I was afraid that after a few weeks, I would, it's really hilly here in Atlanta. I have the only route that can take me for about 55 minutes without being on really steep hills or really busy, dangerous traffic. Atlanta drivers being what they are, even a residential street with no cars usually on it is really dangerous. But but so I have this little route. I just always take it, and I thought, well, this is going to be hard. You know, I have the hills minimized, but there's no, still hills. And in fact, I was about 5 minutes slower than usual, but I I I had the energy for it. I had the stamina for it, and I always love it. But coming back to it after a few weeks away, it's like, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. So that's mine, equally off the cuff. Never told anybody that. I didn't even tell my wife that. Different reasons. So, time you felt like your real self. So we've done all this stuff. And my prompts for you, had I decided to give them, was remember where you were, who was there, what happened, what emotions were felt. That can sometimes help you. And trying to remember what you you saw or heard or felt on your skin or smelled. Those are our traditional, well, tasted. Those are our traditional 5 senses, and so those are a fine place to start. But also, what did you feel in your body? Because I'm largely kinesthetically oriented, so what I felt on that bike ride was mostly in my body, and it was exhilaration. My chest felt exhilarated. There's something about just being able to breathe that much that I hadn't been doing. So these are things, ways to sort of prompt yourself with any story you're looking for, or a story you're trying to learn, figure out more about how to tell, what you see, and so on. And here we have touch, taste, smell, sound, and sight, which are our traditional 5 senses. But as you can tell by this wheel, those aren't the only 5 senses we have. One is things you felt in your body. Number 1 of things you feel in your body, kinesthesia. And kinesthesia is your body motion, the contracting, stretching of your muscles, like that. And that's just a sense of kinesthesia. You may not know the term, but you certainly know it, right? You've had sore muscles. You have worked so hard that your legs are shaking, and any number of other things. Or the feeling that, oh, I worked hard for the last few weeks, and now, oh, it's easy to go up and down the stairs. You know, those are all things. So the second thing you feel in your body is temperature. And we have a sense of temperature. It's not calibrated to Fahrenheit, but nonetheless, we know when we're feeling unpleasantly hot, unpleasantly cold, pleasantly cold. We have a sense of our body's temperature and also how it relates to the temperature of the air and so on around us. Another feeling in your body is what's called the vestibular sense, which includes balance and the position of your body in space, orientation. So, I mean, think about it. We don't even think about having a sense of balance. Have any of you ever experienced vertigo, where your sense of balance goes slowly? I hope you haven't, because it's very unpleasant. Oh, you have, Lorraine, yeah. So you know when that goes fluey, you say, oh, please could I have it back? I didn't know it was important, but I want it back really badly. While you're lying on the bed and you can't, you're afraid, you feel like you're falling when you're just lying there, or however it exhibits itself in you. So the feeling of balance, your orientation in space. You know, if somebody knocked you out and drugged you, blindfolded you, and you woke up and they were hanging, they attached your ankles to a hook in the ceiling, and you were just floating there, you would know you were upside down before you opened your eyes or saw anything. Right? We have a sense of balance, a sense of did any of you used to see Al Capp's? I think his Pogo was his. It was in the funnies in the old days, and he had a thing about the upright gland, which was his play on the prostate gland as the prostrate gland. So if you're not prostrate, then you're upright. Anyway, but that's where my mind went. Sorry. Your sense of gravity in general. You know, you jump up and something brings you down. You may not think about it, but you feel it, you experience it. Or something you experienced in any sensory mode. And here we have, you know, or it took us to touch, taste, smell, sight, the vestibular, temperature, kinesthesia, suffocation. The sense that we need more, need more oxygen. Very important sense, because if we didn't have that, we could get to the point where we were about to faint for lack of oxygen, and it was too late to get any. Right. So the people who didn't have a sense of suffocation, they didn't become our ancestors. Sense of hunger, same thing. If you didn't have a sense that tells you it's time to eat, you could go until you were too weak to actually get food, especially if you were on this African savannah or something. So these are essential to these senses are essential to our survival. Sense of pain, something you've been hurt and you don't notice it. I mean, we think, well, wouldn't it be nice not to feel pain? It's really bad not to feel pain. I've known people who've had impairments either in their whole body, which is quite rare, but in parts of the body. And what it means is they hurt themselves all the time, have no idea until they're bleeding or until they fall over. So these are all very helpful, even though they're not all pleasant. Sense of time passing. So these are 12. We tend to talk about just 6, but this is a good number to really encompass. You could subdivide any of these, and there's some senses that we have that aren't really listed here unless you expand what smell involves or something like that. This is a good starting place. 12 is a good number when we're storytellers to divide things into that. And then you have different kinds of touch. You know, you can have touch on your skin. You can have touch where your tongue touches the roof of your mouth. There's all kinds of touch, and all different parts of your body they can have a sense of touch. But this is a small enough category that it gives you thoughts, and it's a big enough one that there's a lot of choices. So when you're talking about how you felt when a time you felt like your real self, try to remember, what did you see? Just take a moment to just like, hey, back in that memory, what did I see? Were there sounds in that memory? Did I hear things? Were there feelings on my skin, either from touching something, touching myself, from you know, goosebumps, or that sense of skin sensation that comes from emotion, or any other way on your skin? Were there smells or tastes? They're different, but they're related. A lot of what we consider taste is actually smell. And there's different receptors for different things in your mouth and in the back of your throat. But we'll lump them together for now. In this memory, was there anything that you smelled or anything you tasted? Was there anything you felt in your body, in your muscles, or in your internal organs, anywhere else in your body? Or anything else you experienced in any sense that somehow didn't come up by now? So this is an exercise you can take yourself through if you want to. It doesn't, I don't always do it, but if I feel like, oh, I'm not really there, then I'll go through this for myself. You know, were there smells? Were there tastes? And sometimes there aren't, but sometimes there are. And it's like, it makes a big difference. Smell especially is very evocative. But all these useful. So when you when you do that, that part makes sense to imagine, and you can imagine it by yourself or with a listener that you're telling to. Either one is useful. There, if one's easier than the other, by yourself or with a listener, use it. There's no right way to any of this. But when it's time to begin to tell the story, then the helping listener is a big deal. Some people will have a step before they do that, but I find that the sooner I get to the helping listener, the faster the progress goes. Sometimes I don't have a helping listener, so I'll do what I can do. But this is a really big piece of it. And part of it is that when somebody is there listening at all, it makes us more engaged. And if they've agreed to be a helping listener, and that's a role, specific role I'm about to describe, then it's even more useful for you. So the helping listener agrees to listen for the sake of the person they're listening to. Now, that's not the only form of listening. Right now, you're listening to me, and you're not doing it for my sake, you're doing it for your sake. And that's totally appropriate here. Just that in this case, you're listening for your own sake. But if you're listening as somebody else's helping listener, you're listening for the teller's sake, not for your own. Part of the listening, helping listeners' role is to listen with delight. Now, if I'm telling you about how I broke my nose and how painful it was, you don't have to be pleased. Just be glad that I'm telling you. That's what I mean by delight. Not that you're delighted with what happened, you're delighted at the chance to hear it, even if it's painful or hard or disturbing. Also, when you're the helping listener, you don't control the agenda. The person you're listening to controls the agenda. This is just the agreement you make when you take on my definition of a helping listener. Obviously, when you're not a helping listener, but you're listening for someone for your own sake, like you're listening right now to me for your sake, then there's different rules. But if you decide to agree to be someone's helping listener, these are the rules for your role when you are the helping listener. The role of the teller with the helping listener is to remember this is for you, which again, that can be hard to remember. That you have no obligation to entertain or communicate. If they're listening for your sake, then your job isn't to make them happy. Your job is to use them as an echo chamber, as it were, into which you can put your thoughts. So you don't have any obligation to help the other person, to entertain them, even to communicate at all. If what's useful to you is to sit there and just imagine something silently, do that. It isn't the only thing that would be useful, but when it is, you get to do that. And if it's better for you not to speak at all, but just to be imagining or writing with the person paying attention to you, that's fine too. And so, well, I didn't say anything, so I wasn't using my listener. No, you had the incredible presence of somebody who is there for your sake. And I don't know about you, but that's really grounding for me. I can get distracted really easily, but much harder for me, much less likely that I'll get distracted if I have a helping listener, which is why I do most of my story development work, most of my planning of these classes and so on with a helping listener. Now, I don't pay somebody to listen to me all the time. Occasionally I do, but that's rare. And so what I do is we have listening buddies. So if you listen to me for 30 minutes, I listen to you for 30 minutes. No money changes hand, but we both get to be both the helper and the listener. And there's something about alternating the roles that kind of keeps you from being subservient or bossy, because you're in both roles, right? Any questions or comments about this role? A number of you have heard me describe this in the past. Some of you haven't. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go on. Okay. So would one of you please tell a 3 or 4 minute version of the memory that you came up with when I asked you about a time you were your real self to the group. I'll take this slide out of the way so we can just focus on seeing each other. And so I'll stop the sharing. Somebody willing to share? We won't have time for everybody to do it, but at least we'll get the chance to have somebody be listened to. And the other 3 of us will be helping listeners. Sarah looks hesitant. Sue and Lorraine both look like they're seriously considering taking this step.
So this is just what we just already said?
Yeah, it's any version of that. What you came up with first might not be what you would come up with now, but we're using that as a bouncing point. The time you were your real self.
Okay, well, just
Go for it, Sarah. You're on.
When I was asked to be a featured speaker with 40 to 50 minutes time to fill, I knew, of course, that I would be putting together stories because I usually tell shorter 5 to 8 minute stories.
Right.
And the one that came to mind first was a story that was longer, and I thought, oh, I'll tell that one because it's longer. And then I practiced and so on. But in the day of the performance, I thought it's not a good reason just to tell it because it's long. So I didn't. And I told the others, and there were 2 in particular where I felt that I was really there, really doing a good job, and realized that those are the stories from that selection anyway that have the most meaning for me, I guess. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. So first of all, we were being helping listeners. But then the next suggestion is this is all the stuff that you're not seeing this anyway. Yeah, so I want to ask you, Sarah, what did you notice as you told?
This time?
Yeah.
That I felt like I was able to do a clearer, more concise picture of what I did.
Wow.
By saying, anyway, so that, being able to put it in a better frame, I guess. Nice. Which may or may not have been successful for you guys.
Well, we don't have anything to compare it to, but in a bit we'll give you some appreciations, and you'll have a chance to know some of the things we like. What was easy? What was hard?
In that telling?
Yeah.
Well, what was easy was that I had just said most of what I said again. What was hard was that same thing. It was like, I just said this. Is it going to be interesting again? And how can I make it? What did I learn that I can make it a little better or something? Right. Yeah. Which that's more common than we might think. The advantages and disadvantages can come from the same cause. Did your story change in any way through the process of being listened to? I guess I was a little, because of the progression from just an idea to being able to say it again, I was a little more concerned about shaping it so it was interesting, being clear. So more consciously engaged with that process too. Nice. And did you notice yourself making any changes based on that? Well, I didn't tell it exactly the way I had told it before, because I, at the beginning, kind of, I think, did a better job at framing in less time or something.
Sweet. Yes. And you folks are all have enough experience to not to be surprised by this, but this is, for me, how oral storytelling works, how it gets better. And that can be true for written storytelling as well, but oral storytelling in particular, where it's about getting immediate feedback from your listeners. You tell it, you have thoughts as you tell it, you get feedback either explicit in the terms of appreciations and so on, which we'll do in a minute, or implicit by people's breathing or facial expressions, all the rest of that. And so all of that gives you a kind of feedback, and that feedback will generally influence how you tell. And you had an anticipatory sense of that, Sarah, right? It's like, oh, I just told it, so I got to tell it better, or a bit longer. But all those things are things that you tried, not in advance, but as you did it in the process. And there's advantages to both things, doing it as you tell it, but doing it or doing it alone. But there's something wonderful about doing it as you're telling, where you notice, oh, they were supposed to laugh there and they didn't. What am I going to do about that? And I have to take it, either leave it or forget it, or I try to say it better or add to it or something like that. So those are responses you make to your listeners' responses. And that is the essence of communication.
Yeah.
And storytelling, oral, live, in-person storytelling in particular, part of what makes it so wonderful is the ability to do that. And you can use that process of that even if your goal is going to be a written story. Because orally you can make changes. You can be really light on your feet about changes. You don't have to go through the process of writing it down and punctuating it and typing it over or anything like that. Those are all fine things to do. But this process adds something to that, where you can just try stuff out. Be willing to try in the moment. If all you're doing is just reciting a script, there's no such thing as trying in the moment. The thing about when you're in the moment, you're reading conscious and unconscious feedback from your listeners, and you may respond to that. Or you may be experiencing the story in a new way because they're paying attention to you. And then you may discover things just on your own under the light of their appreciative attention. So, anybody have any questions or comments about that story? This is, again, we've been taught to write first, which is fine if that works for you, but it's not the only way. And even if you normally do that, when you get stuck, one thing you might try is telling it aloud. Right? It's nice to have different modalities so that when one thing doesn't work, you have something else to try. Any other questions or comments on this before we go in? Oh, Lorraine.
Just that I really appreciate, Sarah, you sharing that with us and bringing us into your process and your thinking, because it helps me. I learned from that myself, and can apply what your process has been and what you've learned. So thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you.
Yes. Another advantage of helping listeners when you take turns, you get to be the listener. And those things that Lorraine just described will be benefits available to you. Sue.
Well, one thing I appreciated, Sarah, about you're telling, I really noticed more of a sense of aliveness
Hmm.
we're telling this time compared to the last time.
Mm.
And I also appreciated at the end, you were kind of thinking about it and saying, well, I guess it kind of had more meaning for me, what you were telling. So I
Mhm.
appreciated hearing that.
Mm.
Ah, thank you. Thank you.
It's when you do tell for other people and that happens, you don't have to do it if it's for your sake, but if you're feeling generous, letting them know that listening is not just listening.
Mhm.
I didn't do anything, I was just listening. Some of you have surely heard me tell this, but that there's a novel called The Seventh Telling, and in it there's a fictional Jewish Hasidic rabbi who oh, I just forgot what I was going to say. Backed up and so far that I forget where I said it.
The seventh story, the seventh telling.
The seventh telling, yes. Oh, one of the things that this rabbi says is the word just, like just a mother, just a story, just a whatever, that's just a way of hiding the fact that what comes after it is a jewel.
Oh, 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 mm.
So if somebody says just a story, or you find yourself saying just a story, just remind yourself, oh, it's just a way of hiding the fact that the story is a jewel, or that I'm a jewel as a storyteller, or anything like that. So we use that word just to diminish it often in ways that are not helpful. So let me share this part with you guys. So the difference between parts and processes. If you want to learn about flowers, and of course, what we do in our society is we learn the parts of a flower. You probably had some equivalent to this in some science class somewhere in your experience. And parts of the flower are interesting. There's this stigma, whatever that is, right? Pollen tube, anther, filament, petal, ovary. I didn't know they had ovaries, pedicel, and this is very interesting. But what have you learned about how a flower works from that?
Yeah.
Nothing, actually. So if you want to get a flower, you don't get it by assembling the parts. If you want to get a flower, you have to start with a seed. And one of the characteristics of seeds is they don't look like flowers. They'll have some shape, maybe like one of these, but everything is different. Every plant is different as seeds. And the seed is essential to the beginning, but that does not resemble the flower. So here we see a rose hip. The rose hip is the fruit at the base of a rose, and you don't even notice it usually if the blossom is there. But when the blossom petals fall away, you might be able to see it, or when the blossom isn't quite rose yet. And what's in, if you see over here, this left-hand thing, you see a little nut-like thing, a couple nut-like things, and one of them is bigger on the left, and that's actually a rose seed.
Wow.
So most of us don't even know what a rose seed looks like. We know what a rose looks like. And if we're trying to get roses, we're comparing it. We're saying, does this look like a rose? But that isn't going to get you a rose. You need an actual rose seed, which is very different. Come on, little computer. There we go. Spinning, spinning, spinning. So the question is, what's more important, parts or processes? And if you've looked up how to tell a story or how to write a story, I think on the web, you found that there's more than you'd ever have time to look at of people telling you about the parts of a story. And there's some usefulness in that. but it's not the basic usefulness, because you have to grow a story. And to know the parts of it are not essential to growing it. You need to know what a seed is and how you cultivate it. So when you have a seed, you see this little seed over here in the bottom left of my diagram there. So that seed, you have to, if you're going to actually get a rose, say, out of it, you have to do some digging, maybe to put it into first into a pot, for example. You have to water it. You have to make sure there's enough sunlight in particular. You may have to transplant it into another place. If it's something you grew in a pot, then you need to put it in another place. So to do that, you have to do some digging. And when you've transplanted it and it started to thrive and get bigger, you probably want to do some trimming with shears, and eventually you'll have your plant, right? So if that's the nature of creating almost anything, what's the seed for a story? And it can be a memory, like I asked you for a memory, an image of any kind, I asked you for an image, a set of images, a thought, a conceptual thought. I want to tell a story about growing old. Well, that's a concept at that point. I want to tell a story about gaining enlightenment. I want to tell a story about struggling to gain enlightenment and not doing it. All those are thoughts, right? A story seed can just be a few words, a phrase that grabs you and makes you suddenly imagine. It can be something that's evoked by another work of art, another story, a song, a poem, a painting, anything like that, or any number of other things. So the seed of a story doesn't look like a story. And so if you're looking for something that looks like a story, you're probably skipping over a whole lot of story seeds. So how to grow a story, you imagine, and notice I have the little seed there in the imagining, because it's the imagining that gets that seed to begin to grow. You imagine, and then the next thing that usually makes sense is to be listened to about what you've just imagined. And there's a magic thing that happens when you tell it to somebody else. You imagine it more vividly, but you also becomes alive in the space between you, and then you get their responses on top of it, which makes you more aware of it. And so you start an upward spiral of telling, being listened to, or imagining being listened to, and noticing the results and going on. So the process of imagining alternated by being listened to, that's actually has a name in our human world. It's the natural conversational way of developing a story. People who just develop stories not because they're performers or because they've learned some story structure or something, because they're just normal humans developing stories in the course of being a normal human, they imagine and then they tell. And then they get listened to. And then if they're in the process of being listened to, this repeats in parts of the same story. You imagine something, then you listen to about it, and then you imagine the next thing. Or you can talk about imagining the whole story and the responses. This is the natural conversational story growing method. Every human who's become a great storyteller without studying storytelling has used this method. And many of us who have studied storytelling also use this method. And for most people, this is the more effective way. Studying it can augment it, but this is like, you could practice breathing by putting on an oxygen mask, or you could practice breathing by just breathing, right, in a good air. And so the oxygen mask has its time and place, but more or less the best way to breathe is to breathe. And it's similar with these things. So the natural method, you've used it whenever you've told us and retold a story until it gains a set form. You've had that experience, right? Somebody asks you something, how was your operation? How was your wedding? Why did you and your wife split up? Any number, how did you move to where you live? Any of those things we get asked typically in conversation, enough that we begin to start to give it a set form. And that's the natural story development process. We don't have to learn anything for most of us, unless we've done doing something that prevents it, because we've been sidetracked by the school method. So how did you meet your spouse, your partner, how you came to live where you live, your operation, something funny or endearing that you experienced from a child, how you became a storyteller. How did you get interested in this storytelling thing, right? So either you never answer it or you start to tell it and then you just keep building on it until finally get something that people seem to like and you seem to like telling. So it goes on like that. So how do you add to or accelerate natural method? Like I say, great natural storytellers just do that all the time, and it succeeds very well for them. But if you wanted to either make it go faster or to be sure that you're not missing any beats in it, is that something that you could be making it even better that you're not aware of yet, then you can do these things. You imagine it consciously in multiple sensory modes. So you have an episode of memory, think about it. What was it like in terms of what I saw, what I heard, what I felt in my gut, what sounds I heard, were there smells, things like that. That's imagining consciously in multiple sensory modes. Be a very effective way to get you to give you new perspectives, new moments, new appreciations of your story. Your senses include the big five: touch, taste, smell, sight, and sound. There's also many more of them involved. I have a list of 12 here. You could subdivide that into 30 if you wanted. But one of them is kinesthesia, which is the sense of things in your muscles, in particular muscular sensations in your body. Another one that is, I'm not using the latest version of this because I already updated, that's okay. The vestibular sense. Anybody have a sense of what the vestibular sense means? It's the sense of balance, like the vestibule of your inner ear. There's some more things I can say about it, but it's basically your sense of balance and being upright, right? Orientation, space. Your senses include sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, the big five that everybody talks about as the five senses. Sense of time passing is another one we can add to that easily. You do have a sense of time passing. You know, we don't necessarily calibrate it to the number of seconds or even the number of minutes or hours. What we do have, we're aware of time has passed, a lot of time has passed, even more time has passed. So that's a sense we have. These six are all about the outside world. They give us information. There are senses, but they give us information about the outside world. There's others, as you can see, another six more here. The senses of pain, hunger, suffocation, and kinesthesia, right? The sense of balance and so on. Those are all senses, and they have in common that they are things about our internal body. They're information about you. And then we have the sense of temperature and the vestibular sense of balance. Those give you information about your body's relationship to the outside world. Right. We can divide them into those things, your relationship to the outside world. So when you want to add to or accelerate the natural method with all those senses, then you can imagine consciously in multiple sensory modes. And I gave you a list of 12. Each of those can be subdivided, but I think it's a good working number. 30 and even 60 is possible to subdivide, but that's just too many to remember, and many of them won't be appropriate. But and 5 is too few, leaves out too much. So 12 is my approximation. You may want to add something to that list of 12. Being listened to, very important, because at that moment you start to put it into communicative form, and you are also responding to your listener. Helping listeners, especially important form of a listener, because that listener's there for your sake. So you get to be able to try it out, to notice when it's working, but not have a requirement to make it work. Not have to get desperate or to change the story to make it work, to get the person to be listening to. So any questions about any of that stuff? Or comments?
Good stuff, Doug. Good stuff.
Thank you. This is all stuff that's part of the basics. It's not strictly speaking a part of this course, where we're looking at the particulars of the hidden skills. But if we forget about these things, then we don't do as well with the more specialized area we're looking at. So I wanted to give you a chance to be reminded of it, refreshed in it, if you had never gotten the 2-hour version of it, to have a chance to go through it. Anyone have a question? Going? Gone. Okay. So I couldn't do any of those things. I knew we wouldn't be able to. I ended up not giving you the latest version of this. That's all right. Appreciations are an important part of this we didn't get to, but it's another part of the process of growing a story. Very helpful. Okay, have people tell you things they liked about your story. And during that period of time, you're not bracing yourself for suggestions or criticisms. You know that for that period of time, you're only going to get appreciation, so you can open your heart more than you might the other way. Pressing the button, nothing's happening. Okay, so we've done all that. Yada, yada, yada. So something you liked, learned, or found useful from today. We'll begin. Something you liked, learned, or found useful from today.
Well, there was a lot. There's a lot.
Good.
And I guess for me specifically, it was that interesting difference between the first and the second time I told the story.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes. And you know, we've all experienced that, but it's not on our list of things that are supposed to help.
Mm.
But it's actually, if I could only have one tool for improving a story, that would be it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So it's really important to not leave out the most important tool.
Yeah, thank you.
There's others, they're useful, they're worth it. This is the big one. Who's next? Something you'd like to learn or find useful today? Sue?
Well, one thing, and I might have said this before, but I really appreciate the some of the visuals that you give, and I particularly like the menu compared to the food. See, you know, the food is like the blow by blow compared to the menu, which is a summary.
Nice to say.
So I like that. And I also felt that the question about your real self was really a great question. And I certainly saw things about myself in a whole different way.
Wow.
So yeah, thank you.
I just comment on that to say that you know, we think that questions is not learning. You guys are smart enough to not get stuck in that one, but it's worth remembering that not everybody's aware of that. Lorraine, what you got?
Well, I just really enjoy and appreciate just getting to meet with all of you every Wednesday, and it just is really quite helpful. And I'm learning so much about the subject matter and from all of you as you explore it with me.
Thank you. That's part of the reason that classes are more fun than one-on-one. One-on-one has its own charms, but classes allow that cross-pollination as a group. Well, you guys have been wonderful. I really appreciate it. It's been such a joy to have this time with you. And next time we'll kind of go back to our focusing on the sliders and that, but I wanted us to have a time to remember that this is what it's really about, and the sliders are a tool in that direction, not to mistake the tool for the thing. So we don't have class next week. Next week is
Okay.
Memorial Day in the United States, and so there's no class next week at all. Oh yeah, Sue. Oh, you're muted, Sue.
Does that mean on Wednesday there's no class? You're taking the whole
We're taking the whole week off. It's too complicated to have some people on one week and other people on the other week. So just take the week off.
Okay.
You'll have a chance to just let all this stuff settle in, and then we'll pick up. And that was part of the schedule, as I announced it originally. But anyway, so I'll see you in 2 weeks, or 2 weeks less 2 days if you want to attend the other class as well.
Okay.
Great to be with you, and look forward to 2 weeks from now.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
You're
Thank you.
all of you.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye.